people get invested in certain things. Well, a local example is the jeepney. After World War II, surplus U.S. military jeeps were left behind in the Philippines. Filipinos repurposed them into shared taxis, supposedly a temporary solution. But now, may entrenched supply chains, boundary system, jeepney as part of Filipino identity, flexible stop anywhere boarding and lies. These mechanisms make them costly, difficult, and controversial to replace. History matters. No? It's one of my favorite quotations, the historian Tato Constantino. The present is the past. If you see the present as past, you have a glimpse of it. So history matters. In political economy, path dependence means early choices lock in future directions, making change costly even when conditions shift. Laws, organizations, interest groups, and investments adapt to prevailing arrangements. Over time, these elements reinforce one another, producing institutional lock-in and limiting policy options. Just a little bit, I had a book published by the University of Oxford University Press. If you're interested, you can get a QR code. Okay. So what is the basic thesis of this talk? Because of path dependence, the Philippine economy exhibited an oligarchic rent-seeking capitalism and developed extractive institutions. So, ano yung oligarchic rent-seeking capitalism? Where a small elite controls key industries and uses political power to extract wealth through privileges, monopolies, or regulations, rather than productive competition and innovation. So yun ang diferensya between rent-seeking capitalism and dynamic capitalism. Oligarchic rent-seeking capitalism, you have extractive institutions and elite controls economic industries, then pay rent to government to maintain their oligarchic dominance in the economy. So this is the difference between rent-seeking capitalism, dynamic capitalism. In rent-seeking capitalism, extraction of profit through non-market means, profit-seeking through political and other means, let's say monopolies, wealth generation without increased productivity, quotas, licenses, tariffs, etc. As compared to dynamic capitalism, where characterized by competition and monopoly through innovation. You make a profit by satisfying the customer. Say Jollibee, di ba? Meron kayong Chicken Joy. Or creative destruction, yung COVID vaccines, for example, they got a patent, and therefore they, a number of them developed a number of COVID vaccines. We have had So the concept of rent-seeking was developed by the economist Ann Kruger from her observations of foreign exchange allocation in India. So, for example, kung I control all the air in this room, then I'll charge you to breathe. That's rent-seeking capitalism, di ba? Wala ka namang bagong, no value was created by monopoly on the control of air in this room. Next. So using path dependence, we can trace the development of oligarchic rent-seeking capitalism in the country through 7 critical periods. This presentation is a capitalist first. Sige, go ahead. Again. All right. So I guess the story starts with the Belt Trade Act. So kung tatanungin ako, ano yung original sin na handito sa Belt Trade Act? In 1946, the Belt Trade Act specified the conditions under which the US granted independence to the Philippines. So ano yung conditions sa Belt Trade Act? Una, they robbed the Philippines of exchange rate sovereignty. It set an exchange rate of 2 pesos to 1, the same rate before the war and after the war. In other words, the Philippines could not adjust its exchange rate without approval from the US president. It was declared as 2 to 1 before the war, and it's also 2 to 1 after the war. Even if we went through a war, even if we went through a wartime inflation, the US said you have to adopt an exchange rate of 2 to 1. We will see that there's huge implications and more or less sets the tone for the rest of the country's history. It gave free trade to the Philippines for 8 years and capped Philippine exports to the US. It also demanded the parity amendment. It gave US citizens the right to exploit natural resources and own public utilities. It had to expel the Democratic Alliance from Philippine Congress to amend the Constitution to allow American citizens to go to natural resources and public utilities. Bakit nagkaroon ng parity amendment? Kasi noong 1903, yung Cooper Act, American business farmer interests didn't want any competition from the Philippines. So they limited the right of American citizens to own land in the Philippines to, I think, 15 hectares for individuals and for corporations, 1,000 hectares. Because they didn't want competition from American-owned agribusiness enterprises in the Philippines. Now, that's why the Americans invested in mining, natural resources, and in public utilities. But at the 1935 Constitution, limited it only to Filipino majority owned. That is why they demanded the parity amendment. No? Kasi mga Amerikano may-ari noon ng Meralco, di ba? At yung mga natural resources. So the US dangled 800 million in war damage payments and military assistance for hosting US bases. So for post-war reconstruction, in-offer na actually it's about 300-something, 50 million plus additional compensation for hosting the bases. So malaking pera at that time na binigay sa Pilipinas in exchange for the Belt Trade Act. And then, yeah. So tingnan natin bakit napaka diferensya yung ginawa ng Pilipinas sa 2 to 1. Sa ang Japanese yen before World War II was only 350 yen to $1. After the war, the Japanese yen was 50 yen in 1946, 270 yen in 1948, and 360 yen in 1949. Ang laki ng devaluation after the war, di ba? Ng Japanese yen. With an undervalued yen, Japan became an export power and took advantage of the Korean War to sell to US forces. Doon nag-umpisa yung actually yung recovery ng Japan after World War II. No? Next. Ito naman ang South Korea. Actually, they had two currencies. They changed the currency in 1962. But if you compare it, I think it's about 251 to $1 after the war. Eh magkano ang won ngayon? Mga 1,389 won to the US dollar. Ang Pilipinas, 58, 59 to $1. So bakit dinemand ng US yung overvaluation? Yung 2 to 1? Considering ang Pilipinas ang Manila was the second most devastated city after Warsaw, after World War II. Nabomba tayo nung gusto nun, di ba? And yet, 2-1. Bakit dinemand ng US? It prevents agriculture exports from entering the US market and competing with the US producers. Si Representative Bell from ang naglagay nito, di ba? Si repatriate capital after independence at a favorable exchange rate and facilitate the entry of imported American goods. That's the reason why they made it at 2-1. Eh siyempre, pagka in-overvalue mo ng ganyang kalaki, you will have a crisis. But the problem was, you could not adjust the exchange rate. Why was there a crisis? Because nagmura, di ba? Ang imports became very cheap. It's like now, siguro kung 2-1, bibili tayo ng Mercedes-Benz. Mga di ba? Puro imported goods ang kukunin natin kasi napakamura. So that's what happened. We had a crisis in 1949, but we could not adjust the exchange rate. The Belt Trade Act prevented the Philippines from adjusting the exchange rate. It could not use the price system. Therefore, it had to resort to import and exchange controls. Okay. So in the 1950s, we were the second richest country after Japan. We were called the Pearl of the Orient. And then we adopted an inward-looking import substitution industrialization strategy, ISI. So ano yung ISI, import substitution industrial, a development strategy that seeks to reduce dependence on foreign by protecting and promoting domestic industry tariffs, quotas, subsidies, state intervention. We could not adopt any other strategy because we could not adjust our exchange rate. So the idea was really to substitute imports with domestic goods, no? But like in other countries, the periodic with ISI has shown that the said strategy did the opposite. While ISI often succeeds in jump-starting basic manufacturing, it frequently leads to rent-seeking and monopolies, inefficient high-cost industries, weak export sectors, and long-term dependence on protection. I don't know, at that time that we were the second richest, South Korea was one of the poorest. It was even poorer than some African countries at that time on a per capita basis. No? So in 1950, there was an import control board. Kasi the government had to decide kung sino yung makakakuha ng foreign exchange. The market could not determine it. Marcos influenced Peding at Import Control Board. Marcos was known to influence Pedel at the Import Control Board. So we had high tariffs on imported consumer goods, low tariff on intermediate goods, and an overvalued exchange and dollar allocation. So dito nag-umpisa ang politicization of economic decisions. Everything became political. Because you had to go to kailan magmano ka eh. You had to get the blessings of the government to get vital foreign exchange. This is the start of rent-seeking. The politicization of economic decisions started here with controls. So this is a quotation from Ricardo Some Are Smarter Than Others. The principal way through which Marcos acquired money was as a member of Congress was through the control he exerted over the black market for foreign exchange and the importation of goods into the country in 1963. Marcos authored a law which placed restrictions over the import of goods to the country. Those who wanted to import goods had to secure and import license. Marcos managed to control the granting of these permits, which he later peddled to importers. So, diyan nag-umpisa di ba? Rent-seeking through foreign exchange controls. So, hindi bago yung corruption, way back pa 1950s. But the acquisition of Hacienda Luisita in 1957 showed that due to government controls, all economic decisions had become political. A government loan and a government guarantee for a dollar loan from manufacturers was required to buy out Tabacalera, which owned Hacienda Luisita. Because Tabacalera, it's a Spanish company, was being harassed by the hooks, by the hook balahap. They wanted out. But to be bought out, you need $1, di ba? President Magsaysay did not want to give Hacienda Luisita to the Lopezes. So his young aide, Ninoy Aquino, presented his in-laws, the Coancos, as the buyers. Then you will see that lahat has become political. An overvalued exchange rate and inward-looking import industrialization strategy penalizes farmers and agriculture. Kayo, nasa agriculture kayo, di ba? An overvalued exchange rate penalizes agriculture because agriculture has a high domestic value added, unlike import-dependent industries. It penalizes exporters, especially at that time, most of our exports were agricultural, coconut, abaca, etc. Rewards importers and domestic monopolies with access to foreign exchange. Encourages extraction of natural resources, mining and logging, makes labor unattractive to foreign investors, and the domestic market remains small compared to export markets, therefore unattractive to investors. So, I'm just quoting here from Asimiglo and Robinson's in Why Nations Fail. Says that their rent-seeking leads to the development of extractive institution. National scientist Dr. Raul Favela says capitalism needs rules to function, but in the Philippines, the rules themselves are for sale. Without rules, chaos results. The development of a chaotic society is not conducive to investments. There is no rule of law. Sige. So, 1952, time of President Pidio Quirino, the Hawks were already in Bulacan. The Hawks were the Hukbong Bayan Laban sa Hapon. They were a peasant guerrilla group that transitioned from fighting the Japanese to became a peasant movement, an armed peasant movement. So, again, because I guess of the overvalued peso, nahirapan ng agriculture. Anyway, there was a lot of unrest. Also because of the land question. Andiyan na sila sa Bulacan. They were threatening Malacanang. Therefore, in 1954, Ramon Magsaysay, who was then the defense secretary, became president. He was the one leading the fight against the Hawks. But he realized that the Belt Trade Act was a contributor to our problems. No? So he renegotiated the Belt Trade Act with the Laura-Langley Agreement. Ano yung Laura-Langley Agreement? It gave exchange rate sovereignty back to the Philippines. Ibig sabihin, we can adjust the exchange rate if we wanted to. Hindi na kailangan ng permission ng US President. However, it gave US citizens the monopoly right to own land for 25 years versus other foreign investors. So, binigyan ng karapatan ang mga Amerikano na to own land. Previously, hindi bawal yon. Parity rights retained for 25 years and expanded to all businesses. Gave preferential tariffs to Philippine goods and increase the U.S. sugar quota. So, in 1957, Garcia becomes president, adopts Filipino First. Ano ba yung Filipino First? Actually, yung Filipino First refers to foreign exchange. Hindi masyadong alam ng tao yun. Ha? Anong ibig sabihin Filipino First? Filipino First in the allocation of foreign exchange. Because at that time, the banks were giving the Americans the priority in the access to the foreign exchange. So ang call ni Garcia was Filipino First. Economic nationalist ideology pervades the bourgeoisie. Meron ring racist undertones. Kasi naging anti-Chinese rin. So, ito yung panahon nila, Tanyada, Recto, etc. Economic nationalism pervades the bourgeoisie. Anti-foreign, anti-colonial. But why didn't the Philippines devalue after regaining exchange rate sovereignty under the Laurel-Langley Agreement? 1955, binalik na yung sovereignty. Bakit di tayo nag-devalue? After all, we went through the war, we were prevented from adjusting the exchange rate, and yet, how come we didn't devalue in 1955? Well, merong debate noon between Cuaderno and Araneta. Salvador, I don't know if you know Salvador Araneta, he was Secretary of Agriculture, well, under Magsaysay, hindi ba? He founded at what is now called RFM, the first flour mill. He was also founded Araneta, very well known in veterinary medicine and agriculture. He founded Fiati. He was a pioneer in the airline business. No, Fiat. Araneta was for devaluing the peso. He was supported by the sugar planters, actually. He was for devaluing the peso and having an expansionary fiscal policy. Cuaderno opposed him. No? Cuaderno was committed to a tight monetary policy and also a strong peso. Bakit? Kasi, siyempre, he exercised immense power to foreign exchange controls, similar to how the DA now manages agricultural import controls. Immense power yun eh. So why will you give it up? Hindi ba? And the vested interest already formed around maintaining a strong peso. When I say strong, ibig sabihin overvalued. Ibig sabihin dapat mas maging competitive para makapag-export tayo, for example. Americans with business protected by high tariff walls and controls. Because of the Laurel-Langley Agreement, makapag-set up sila ng businesses dito. Behind the high tariff walls. And the import-dependent industrialists were also for a strong peso because access nila for their capital goods came at a cheaper, when they have access to a peso it's not competitive. And the sugar block was mollified by the U.S. sugar quota. Before, the sugar block was for a devaluation. But na-mollify sila with the U.S. sugar quota. In contrast, Taiwan devalued in 1958 and shifted from import substitution to export promotion, establishing the foundation for its rise as an industrial power. Tayo, ayaw nilang i-devalue. That's why even noong nagkaka-crisis na, Cuaderno and Garcia imposed an import tax of 20%. But that did not stem the crisis because walang incentive yung exports to increase. No? So the economic crisis continued. But merong geopolitical event in 1959 that also affected us. This was the fall of Cuba to Castro. Nagkaroon ng higher allocation to local traders to send bigger sugar volumes at low tariffs and above world market prices. Ito yung sugar quota. It led to the rise of pro-US big landlords and politicians like Benedicto, Montalivono, etc. Reinforced rent-seeking. Kasi you can just sell your sugar abroad at above world market prices, no? Until now, again, this example of path dependence, they're politically powerful. Hanggang ngayon, they're in fact calling for more restrictions in the importation of sugar and sugar substitutes like corn syrup, di ba? Anong effect nito? It leads to the stunting of food manufacturing here. Because ang sugar natin is twice the world market price, di ba, Fermin? It's twice the world market price. So, we ban sugar here, regulate the importation of sugar, have high local price of sugar, but we allow the importation of finished sugar in terms of beverage, in terms of cookies, etc. Hindi ba? So, ang food manufacturing natin cannot prosper because, again, of maybe path dependence. No? So, makapagal and decontrol. Makapagal run on the concept of decontrol, which is remove na nga yung controls. So, he got elected in 1961. Macapagal was the son of the father of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. He had a PhD in economics from UST, actually. He was a poor boy from Lubao. He imposed a decontrol of the peso. So the peso devalued from $2.30 to $1 to $3.90 to $1. However, not a free market exchange rate as foreign currency remained under central bank's control. However, the regime of quotas and high tariffs remained. May mga quotas pa rin. If you wanted to import apples, for example, you had to have a quota. Lahat may quota. Hindi ba? So, andun pa rin yung regime na yun of quotas and high tariffs. So neighboring countries started developing light industries for the export market like toys, garments, consumer ornaments, shoes. Philippines stuck with exporting primary agricultural goods like copra, abaca, and sugar. There was also a corruption scandal during Macapagal's time. So hindi lang tayo DPWH scandal. You look this up, Harry Stonehill. He's the guy, he's an American GI. He controlled the tobacco trade in the Philippines. No? However, he also establishes several businesses here. Manila Memorial Park, Republic Glass, ganon. Now, ano nangyari noong kay Harry Stonehill? Jose W. Jokno, who was Secretary of Justice at that time, raided, with the NBI, raided the offices of Stonehill. They found a black book na handon lahat yung binibigyan niya ng mga bribes. I think starting with Macapagal, Marcos, etc. No? So, at that time, corruption really reached in high places already. But, ang ginawa, in-exile na lang siya. No? So, next. So, in 1965, Marcos was elected. The Philippines can be great again. He was the original MAGA. Di ba? the Philippines can be great again. He switched from the Liberal Party to the Nationalista Party to run for president. Next. Oh, this is a historical event. Siguro alam niyo to sa UP Los Baños. The re-establishment of the Communist Party of the Philippines by Jose Maria Sison, aka Amado Guerrero, or so-called beloved warrior, under Marxism-Leninism Mao Zedong taught. It was re-established in Alaminos, Pangasinan, with about 13 people. Si Joma Sison copied he went to Indonesia and studied there. Actually, he copied PSR from Indonesia. No? So according to him, the NPA is the spear, the National United Front is the shield. What is the National United Front? It's a coalition of workers, peasants, petty bourgeoisie, and nationalist businessmen. Take note, nationalism is part of that coalition. And the three evils were U.S. imperialism, semi-feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism. So in March 1969, the New People's Army was established with Dante Buscaino, Cadante as NPA head in Tarlac, with 60 Red fighters and aging World War II weapons. 60 lang at that time. Huh? By the time Marcos fell, the number of NPA fighters was 25,000. So you could see the growth of the insurgency under the dictatorship. In November 1969, Marcos becomes the first Philippine president re-elected. Previous to him, no Philippine president had been re-elected. With guns, goons, and gold. He used a central bank, then under executive control, to implement expansionary monetary policy to aid his re-election campaign. The expansionary monetary policy leads to another foreign exchange crisis. So, nagkaroon ng foreign exchange crisis, so the peso was devalued from 390 to 640 to $1. A severe economic crisis aggravated by monopolies. I remember there was even a petroleum club where the oil majors would connive to fix prices. No? So maraming monopolies na yun. So the inflation reached 17%. Nagkaroon ng, of course, the students got radicalized. The first quarter storm, Malacanang attack by CCP-led Kabataang Makabayan. Ang UP Los Baños rin, I think, was in the forefront, di ba? You had activists like Vic Laddad coming from the UP Los Baños. He was, I think, student council president then, di ba? So this is how poor we were before. Sige, go ahead. In 1971, the Plaza Mirada bombing during Liberal Party rally blamed on Marcos but later exposed a scheme of Jose Maria Sison to split the ruling class. So, yung noon, nag-rally yung Liberal Party, which is the opposition, there was a bombing. That's why Sila Salonga got hurt. No? It was blamed on Marcos, but later turned out it was ordered by Jose Maria Sison of the CPP. In 1972, the socio-economic crisis caused by the peso devaluation and the struggle between the Lopez and Marcos ruling factions led President Marcos to monopolize power by declaring the Philippines under martial law. Well, dictatorship is the ultimate rent extraction power. You have unlimited authority to grant favors, hindi ba? So that was the logical consequence of our rent-seeking system, was really authoritarianism. Now, there was a geopolitical event that again affected the Philippines. This is the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War was when Egypt and Syria attacked Israel. As a result of that, the oil Arab countries put up an oil boycott and raised prices of oil by 4 times. So what happened was the Arab countries suddenly became flush with money. They deposited this money to New York-based money center banks, money center banks in New York, which then recycled the oil money to develop import-dependent oil import-dependent developing countries like the Philippines. So, nagkaroon ng easy access ang Marcos regime to foreign money because of the recycling, no? Petrodollars, no? Sige. So, during martial law, nag-shift ang buong bansa to the left. The NPA successfully links anti-fascist struggle to economic nationalism. Fight against, quote, U.S. Marcos dictatorship. The youth were radicalized. Miski na yung mga upper middle class, sila sa Ateneo, di ba? Sila Ed Hobson. These were rich from upper middle class families. Ed Hobson was student council president, and his father owned a supermarket. No? They were radicalized and went to the hills and became communists. No? So, nakita natin na radicalize ang kabataan noong panahon na yon, including students from UP Los Baños. So, ito yung picture lang nung kasi mga bata pa kayo, you have probably no sense of how it was. The students were out there in the streets, no, demonstrating. Kasama ka dyan, Fermin. Ako, I was in front of Malacanang during the first quarter. So, anyway, in 1973, under martial law, Marcos Sr. passed the 1973 Constitution through a sham plebiscite. The 1973 Constitution bars foreign ownership of natural resources, public utilities, mass media, and education institutions. It expanded on the restrictions the 1935 Constitution. So, matindi pa rin yung economic nationalism. Kita mo sa Constitution na handyan. So, the Marcos years were characterized by export-oriented, import-dependent industrialization. Exporting of yung pag-export ng Filipino labor natin, nag-umpisa yan under Marcos. Because we had to start generating foreign exchange to pay off our debt and also our trade deficit. Yun ang problema natin. We had perennial trade deficit. Mas malaki yung imports natin than we exports. Again, because of our history of overvaluation and not an import depend in inward-looking import industrialization, import intensive. Intensification of mining and logging exports led to environmental destruction. Mark Hopper. The government imposed reforestation fee, gave out short-term licenses, resulting in the denudation of Philippine forests. At that time, the government gave out timber licenses, no? Pero short-term, 5 years, at may reforestation fee. Ibig sabihin, the government said, ako ang bahala mag-reforest. Of course, that did not happen. Kasi if you think of it, the loggers actually had an interest to maintain their inventory, if they had property rights. But wala nga eh. Short-term licenses ang binigay. Okay? So, the Philippines gave the term of crony capitalism to the world. During Ferdinand Marcos' presidency, his close associates, commonly known as Marcos cronies, profited from the relationship with him through legal aid, political favors, and business monopolies. These individuals received government contracts and funds, so-called behest loans, often marked by corruption allegations. Monopolies created in sugar, si Benedicto, and coconut, Coamco. Crony capitalism is the overt, severe form of rent-seeking capitalism. Another geopolitical event affected the Philippines. This was the fall of the Shah of Iran. Why? Because oil prices doubled. And we're oil import country. At the same time, we had perennial trade deficits. So this was the beginning of the foreign exchange crisis. This further aggravated by the Volcker shock. U.S. Treasury Secretary Volcker at the time, during Reagan, to control the stagflation, imposed harsh monetary policies. The federal funds reached 19%. Eh tayo, we are a significant borrower, di ba? So, tinamaan tayo ng pagtaas ng interest rate globally. It triggered the U.S. recession, put a debt-ridden Philippines on the ropes. Kasi nga naman, tumaas yung interest rate na napakataas. Sige. So, as we can see, from crisis to crisis, continuous trade and balance of payments deficits caused the economy to lurch from one balance of payments and forex crisis to another. 1949, 59, 1970, 81. So succession of crises we faced. No? So former President Marcos did not change the protectionist inward-looking economy as increased access to foreign loans allowed him to finance authoritarian rule without major economic reforms. Over time, the country's dollar earnings were not enough to finance the increasing trade deficits and burgeoning interest payments and repayment of foreign loans, causing another forex crisis. To be fair, actually, sila Birata and Sikat tried. In the beginning, they were the ones who advised Marcos to devalue, to set up PESAs, export processing zones. Unfortunately, they were sidelined by the increasing access to foreign loans, the cheap one. Wala nang incentive to make major reforms because of the easy access to foreign loans. At the same time, Marcos got sick. As you know, he had a kidney disease. And then Imelda and the other politicians ascended over the technocrats, and the technocrats were set aside. Anyway, we face another crisis na naman. So in 1981, Marcos got elected for the third time, banking and financial crisis triggered by the Dewey scandal. So nag-spread na yung crisis, nag-umpisa sa banking. No? In 1983, assassination of Ninoy Aquino in August, the central bank books were cooked. It found out that they were showing some foreign exchange deposits and they did not have it. So it led to the bankruptcy of the Philippines and a 90-day debt moratorium. Country witnessed capital flight. GDP contracted by 10% over a 2-year period. So it was a very period of severe hardship for the Philippines before. I remember mga MBA nagbebenta ng food carts. There were also frequent brownouts. I don't know if you remember that time. No? Okay. In 1984, 85, they didn't want To control inflation, supposedly, the central bank imposed Jobo bills. Interest rates reached up to 40%. Namatay yung lahat ng industry when you have interest rates that high. And the peso was devalued from 11.19 to 11 to 19 to $1 in 1984. So in 1986, there was the snap presidential elections and the People Power Revolution, EDSA. New Aquino administration took over the newly established constitution that we adhere to today. So, yung EDSA, a case of strange bedfellows coalition. Nagkaroon ng temporary alliance. Yung anti-Marcos oligarchy, the Lopezes, the Ayalas, etc. The Catholic Church, si Cardinal Sin was at the forefront of the EDSA revolution. Left of center elements, saka CPP-NPA. Di ba? The CPP-NPA especially was pinning down the armed forces of Marcos with 25,000 armed rebels. So yun ang People Power Coalition. So the Yellow Revolution was not really a revolution, but the restoration of pre-martial law order of alternating factions through elections. At the same time, it was not really a revolution because it was also based on the old idea of economic nationalism. In fact, it's even became even more intense because part of the coalition were the leftists. So the 1987 Constitution reflects the different interests of EDSA's strange bedfellow coalition. It enshrined Filipino first and Filipino-only provisions in the Constitution. Basahin yung Constitution, marami doon Filipino first at Filipino-only. Public utilities, natural resources, educational institutions, marami. In fact, mas marami pa restrictions than before because it extended it to the practice of professions and mass media and advertising. Di ba? And then, it made abortion constitutionally illegal. Yun ang concession sa Catholic Church, hindi ba? That is why the Catholic Church is kind of conservative. They don't want to change the Constitution. Mandated asset distribution and social justice. Basahin yung Constitution. Ang dami doon kung about social justice. But through asset distribution, which means you take away from the landed and give it to the landless. That's the definition of social justice. Enshrine statism by provisions mandating the regulation of capitalism. It's very statist ang orientation ng ating constitution. One of the longest constitutions in the world designed to make it difficult to make changes. Yung mga iba, simple lang. Kamukha sa Vietnam. Tayo, I think ang kapal We have one of the longest, 30,000 words ata yun Sige. So, anong nangyari? Filipino first and Filipino-only provisions led to increasing industrial concentration at its monopolies and oligopolies dominated most industries. The World Bank said that the Philippines is one of the most concentrated economies, the most concentrated, economy in Asia, together with Bangladesh. That is, monopolies and oligopolies dominate in almost a lot of industries. Statism led to overregulation, corruption, and weak institutions. Lag ban, greening program, which are all failures. And then also boutique capitalism, a powerful predatory oligarchy based on an incoherent, incompetent bureaucracy. Sabi ni Paul Ashcroft. That's a book on the politics of banking in the Philippines. Because of the People Power Revolution, we had what they call the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law. Ang problema, it was poorly designed. Prolonged implementation, 1987 to 2012. In Taiwan, it was only 5 years. No? It made an inefficient government the landlord. Dati, yung landlord would at least support the peasants. Now, they transferred that function to the government. But the government still failed to help the peasants, no? The peasants. Saddled the lowest beneficiaries with debt, 30-year amortizations, and because of those restrictions, they could not borrow or sell the land. And the land became unbankable. Restricted the land market, the land retention limit to 5 hectares. Kayo, farmer, you're not supposed to be successful. Because you cannot expand beyond 5 hectares. That's still in the law. And assume farmers don't die. Ang ngayon, may problema na, second generation problems, kasi namatay na yung original beneficiaries. Paano kung may akong 5 anak? They all have to sign for that land to be sold or leased. What if hindi mo na makita? In fact, I think there's a phenomenon now in the country, you're in agriculture, that the ones stealing the soil are not the ones on the title. Malaking problema yan. No? It sacrificed middle-class landlords, spared the big landlords kasi yung mga big landlords binigyan ng way out through so-called stock distribution. Pero yung mga middle-class sinacrifice. So, ang result niya, land fragmentation, low agricultural productivity, high food inflation, high agricultural trade deficit, only major agricultural exports are plantation crops, pineapple and banana. Ito yung study ni Adamopoulos and Justicia, very prestigious, the National Bureau of Economic Research. Land reform decreased average farm size by 34% and productivity by 17%. So the landless peasants became impoverished landlords. That's the irony of it all. No? And then, I don't know if you have read Otsuka, who is formerly with IRI, was the chair of IRI, world-renowned scientist in agriculture. Sabi niya, small is beautiful pag maraming surplus labor. Pero pag wala ka ng surplus labor, it doesn't make sense. You need scale, you need mechanization. No? Ngayon, I don't know, I've talked to some farmers and sabi nila, mahirap kumuha na ng rural labor. Because they prefer urbanization, maybe tricycle driver or construction worker. Ayaw na magtrabaho sa farms. So that's the problem. But you cannot mechanize. The average land size now is just 1 hectare. Labor rigidity and industrialization, high minimum wages relative to productivity, unreasonable labor security provisions, an increase in paid holidays equivalent to 14-month pay. So ang resulta noon was flight of labor-intensive light manufacturing to Vietnam and Bangladesh, despite Philippine unemployment and underemployment totaling 20 to 25% of the labor force. Our labor costs here are high relative to productivity. And then the peso is not devalued to reflect that. So nag-alisan lahat yung mga garments. It went to Bangladesh and Vietnam. Whereas ang unemployment and underemployment natin is about 1/4 of the labor force. So we drove them away. Labor rigidity is caused by populist and anti-capitalist labor code. Leftist lobbies became Secretary of Labor under Aquino. Monopolists didn't care as they were extracting high monopoly rents. Okay lang sa kanila to increase, keep on increasing minimum wages eh. Kasi meron naman silang monopoly rent eh. Hindi ba? If you were group, would it matter to you kung tinaas ng, no? Hindi. Okay. So, isa pang nangyari noon na hanggang ngayon apektado sa atin. The 1987 Constitution mandated the independent central bank in reaction to Marcos, but Republic Act 7653 stripped the institution of its developmental functions and limited its mandate to price stability. Unlike in the US, where the Federal Reserve operates under a dual mandate of ensuring price stability and promoting full employment. Saka nag-subscribe tayo doon sa Washington Consensus eh. This led to the Asian financial crisis because ang nangyari, the central bank favored a overvalued peso. It attracted short-term capital movements to finance our current account deficit. And nung umalis yung hot money, biglang it resulted in a crisis for the economy. Kasi marami kumpanya umutang in dollars because it was cheaper, because they thought that there was a implicit support for the peso dollar rate. So there was a forced devaluation of the peso from 26 to 42.7. So crisis na naman. Nag-devaluation tayo pag nagkakaroon ng crisis. According to national scientist Dr. Raul Fabella, in the Philippines, the economy is characterized by high contribution from the service sector and a relatively smaller manufacturing base. This pattern mirrors the symptoms of development progeria, where rapid initial growth fails to translate to sustained industrialization and long-term economic resilience. A strong peso creates a bias against tradables. Anyway, I'll discuss this later about us being a low productivity service economy. So, we are de-industrializing. I think we have another graph, right? To show that the service sector is about 60% of our GDP. Manufacturing industry keeps going down. Okay, so it's the age of globalization. In 1990s, our tariff rates were reduced because of our we participated with the ASEAN free trade agreement. And the oligarchy shifted to non-tradable services, banking, telecommunications, power distribution, shipping, PPPs with government. They did not go into export, they went into regulated services. Unlike real estate, non-tradables kasi wala kang competition. Unlike when we reduced tariffs, there was imported competition. Actually, ang tinamaan, I think, are those small industries in Caloocan and in Malabon. Di ba? Okay. Yeah, telecommunications, water, power, air transfer were privatized, deregulate. So, under the Washington Consensus, privatize and deregulate. We're continuing to fall behind. Vietnam, who went through a war, is now ahead of us in GDP per capita. Their projected growth now is about, I think, 7 to 8%, di ba? Tayo, we're falling, even slowing down to less than 5%. It was 3% the last quarter. So before we were ahead of Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam in the 1950s, 60s. Now we're near the bottom. So in poverty rate, we're still around 14.5%. Actually, if you Vietnam is ang baba, and then actually for the Philippines, the poor and near poor, if you look at the surveys of Mahar Mangas, it's about half of the population are considered poor and near poor. Okay. So I'm jumping because I want to discuss kasi the historical events. Anyway, Aquino imposed a total lag ban, a total mining ban. At that time, there were high prices of telecom because foreign companies were not allowed to enter because of the constitution. It killed the congressional initiative to amend the 1987 constitution. There was some deterioration of peace and order, but restored macroeconomic stability with sin taxes. So, itong theory ko, the Philippines has moved right. Before, it moved left because of the people power revolution. Ngayon, it has moved right with Dutertismo. Because 34 years after the Yellow Revolution, the business and economic model of the Yellow Revolution is exhausted and no longer working. Just as globalization led to Trumpism, you know, globalization, as you know, destroyed all the manufacturing jobs in Middle America. No, that's why it made you pro-Trump sila. Whereas the coastal elites were the ones who benefited from the trade, global trade. The failures of the people power revolution led to Dutertismo. BBM is an extension of Dutertismo. Di ba? Unity team. No? Sige. So the Filipino first and Filipino only provisions result in the most concentrated economy in Asia. Monopolies and oligopolies abound. Rent-seeking economy. That's why for a time, I think until now, our telecom rates are one of the highest with a poor service. Hindi ba? Hopefully, the Konektadong Pinoy Act in the Public Service Act will correct that. No? Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law led to low agriculture productivity and high food prices. Hanggang ngayon, mataas pa ang ating presyo ng pagkain. The labor rigidities and the strong peso led to de-industrialization and a low productivity service economy. Our GDP is primarily powered by consumption spending, 70%, I think. It's about 70% in consumption. We have one of the lowest investment spending as a percentage of GDP. Sige. And statism and asset distribution and social justice led to corrupt and inefficient state, redistribution of poverty, and I would say the neglect of education. Because the emphasis was on social justice, ayuda, land reform, we neglected education. And I'll show you the statistics of education. May iiyak kayo. Because students now, when they reach high school, they have zero learning. That's the latest EDCO report. So we had an elite democracy, we had a lack of political party system, we have a proliferation of political dynasties and populism. So overall, more than 30 years after the Yellow Revolution, we still have massive poverty, high income inequality, chaotic society with no rule of law, and low investment spending. So, I'm not partisan. I'm just an analyst, right? So, I'm not a Duterte or a Yellow or whatever. So Duterte was a historical break in the sense that he went after the Aquinos and the Yellow forces. Sige. So his role was characterized by a war on drugs, strong anti-communist agenda, war against the Yellow Coalition, did not renew the ABS-CBN franchise, rejected PPP financing, expressed their disdain from Manila-based oligarchs. However, in terms of legislation, he has the most substantial economic and social legislation. Key economic legislation, marami. But one of the most significant for agriculture was the dismantling of the monopoly on National Food Authority. Bruce, weren't you part of that? Yeah. That was very hard. The monopoly of NFA on rice importation. Because that monopoly was abolished, rice prices went down, right after. That contributed to the popularity of Duterte. No? But anyway, marami. The Public Service Act, which amended the public service to allow foreign companies in transport and telecommunications. Because of that, Public Service Act, Starlink came in and started offering broadband, right? Because of that, now you see not just Grab, but you see Green GSM. What's that? There's this Russian company, right? So marami ng because of we have now a little bit more competition. Sige. So, yan ang mga social legislation under Duterte. Including the Universal Healthcare Act, the Mental Healthcare Law, Safe Spaces Act, Free Tertiary Education Law, the Bangsamoro Organic Law, etc., etc. Of course, we know he did a lot of wrongs too. Militarized the pandemic response, which caused the economy to contract by 7%. I think my view is it was a disaster. It reduced taxes, but it did not increase investments. Allowed Chinese criminal elite to flourish, created private rights uncertainty by rescinding PPP contracts, and pivoted away from PPP in favor of Chinese aid, which did not come anyway. Sige. So some of the achievements that he made, we had encouraged competition, including DITO for, I understand even for data now, DITO is better than Globe or Smart. That's what I hear from people, no? The ARTA law, corporate charter amendments, BSP law, SSS law, reformed the tax law. Before napakataas because of inflation, a lot of middle class employees were being pushed up the high tax bracket. So pinalitan yon, including the inheritance tax and the income tax. Okay, let's. So his election represented a counterpoint or antithesis to the 1986 People Power Revolution that toppled his father, perhaps a reflection of the failures of the 1987 Constitution. One would have thought that they were gone in power forever. But maybe because of a reaction against the failures of the Yellow Revolution, he came back to power. Sige. So, is he moving in the right direction? He has some legislative accomplishments, including the Konektadong Pinoy Act, debt condonation law, 99-year lease law, etc. But He retains agriculture protectionism, and there's a bias for a strong peso policy. We'll see later on how. So this is the situation now. In my view, there's a development of underdevelopment. No? Sige, we're growing GDP, but the structure, the foundations are very fragile. Sige. The economy is growing but slowing down from targeted 6% to 4.5%, supposedly because of the flood control mess, and the government have started slowing down spending. No? Now, we need to grow around 8% to wipe out poverty. So we're even falling behind. The government's goal was around 5 to actually 6%. But now even 5% looks unattainable. I have talked to some analysts, they think it's going to be below 5 this year, 4.8%. So the Philippines continues to de-industrialize. Our manufacturing value added keeps going down. Meron ba tayong share yung sa Cambodia? Yeah. No. Hindi. But our manufacturing share to GDP is just ahead of Mongolia and Laos. That's how de-industrialized we are. We are not more in low productivity services. Diyan ba? Yan. Ito tayo, in terms of manufacturing GDP. Why does this thing matter? Because the good jobs are in manufacturing. The services that we have are low productivity services. Wash your car boys, fast food worker, ganoon. So even though they are employed, they are in poverty. No? Our agriculture productivity remains low. I got this from you, Fermin. In terms of, no, not this one, the food prices. But anyway, tingnan mo, 20 to 23% are employed in agriculture. But it only contributes, in fact, now I think it's only 8% to GDP. That's how inefficient our agriculture is. In the US, 1% of the population feeds the entire United States. And it exports pa. 1% of a population of 300 million pa sila? 350 million. Tayo, 20 to 23% contributes only 8% of GDP. So, 1 in 4 Filipino works, but their GDP is a measly 8%. Sige. Ito, kinuha ko sa iyo, Fermin. Pork prices 2 times that of Thailand or Vietnam. Our chicken prices 40% higher than Vietnam. And sugar prices are 2 times world market price. Actually, a lot of the commodities now are lower than the Philippine local prices. That's why if you also travel to Vietnam, ang mura ng pagkain dun, di ba? No? So that's a challenge for you in agriculture. Ang sama ng ating record sa agriculture. Yung meat comparison, I think, so we are higher than Vietnam and Thailand. Ano pa? So small-scale agriculture not conducive to modernization, increased agriculture productivity. Our average land size is now less than 1 hectare. That is why most farmers now are just part-time farmers. They cannot sustain themselves from farming alone. That's why nagiging tricycle driver sila or construction worker. Di ba? Part-time. So how can you increase productivity if they're part-time farmers? No? The average age of Filipino farmer, I think 57, 58 years old. No young people don't want to go into farming. And the average education attainment is grade 4. So how can you modernize agriculture if this is your foundation? So growth is driven by low productivity services, 62.1%. It's not like the services of the US in London where it's finance or Singapore, right? High value, high tech. Tayo, low productivity services. Mga, yung fast food, retail, etc. Ano pa? Ayun. Most of the employment are in wholesale and retail trade, repair of motor vehicles and motorcycles. No? So the economy now is overly dependent on OFW remittances and BPOs because we have a huge trade deficit, about 46 to 52 billion ang ating trade deficit. Very high trade deficit. It's now also only being financed by OFWs and BPOs. But the BPO is facing headwinds. There are geopolitical risks. There is a bill now pending to penalize outsourcing in the US. And of course, artificial intelligence is threatening our BPO industry. Of course, if you talk to the BPO, they feel that it is, it's not a threat, but sooner rather than later, it might threaten our. So ang problema niyan, pag nawala tayong BPOs, how will we finance our trade? Another crisis could come. The country's young demographic profile is supposed to be an advantage, but according to the World Bank, the Philippines functional illiteracy is at 90%. 10-year-olds cannot grasp simple concepts. Sige. According to the PSA, 1 in 5 senior high graduates cannot comprehend what they read. Only 4 out of every 1,000 senior high school students meet expected learning standards. 1% na lang yung actually. Yung under that. So, becoming a nation of bobo. Sorry to say, The PISA results, we are near the bottom. The PISA results, it measures our achievements in math, reading, and science for 15-year-olds. We're near the bottom. So the corruption continues because of the same institutions for foster rent seeking. The flood control is not unique or new, but only an episode of our rent seeking history. Our real interest rates is higher than our neighbors. This is punitive to debtors. I'm just giving this as an example to show that our monetary policy is too tight, and our peso is too strong. That's why you see a lot of inventory of real estate. The difference between the real inflation rate and interest rates about 3%, 2 to 3%. In Thailand, it's almost zero. In Vietnam, it's just 1%. Well, you were in the monetary board, Juan, but they have a bias for a strong peso and tight money. The Marcos doesn't want peso to reach 60 to 1. Now, how can the economy grow? That means you have to keep your monetary policy tight. So he is in a contradiction. The economy is slowing down, and he still wants the peso to be strong. He doesn't want if that means the central bank will not do jumbo cuts, right? To show you how overvalued the peso is, in India, our exchange rate was the same in 2010, 45 to 1. Now, we are 59, India is 92. I was talking to a manpower exporter, was telling me that he's losing his market to Indian engineers. Why? Two things. One is that the peso, our peso is not competitive. And secondly, our engineers don't have any experience because manufacturing is shrinking. In fact, nagsara na ang, what's that, petrochemical in Igokong Way, right? So, you cannot be hard without experience. And yet, it's a catch-22. They can't have experience because manufacturing is declining. And then the peso makes it very hard. Sige. So tourism, we're the lowest in terms of visitor numbers, just 4 million. Vietnam is 14 million. Thailand is 21 million. Bakit? Of course, we have lack of infrastructure, etc. But the real reason is in dollar terms, it's very expensive to visit the Philippines. Hotel rates are 30 to 40% more expensive in dollar terms. Even the food here is more expensive. That's why, unless they depreciate the peso, tourism will continue to be in the doldrums. So anyway, these are hotel rates. As you can see in Thailand and Vietnam. That's why marami kong alam, instead of going to Siargao or Boracay, they go to Vietnam, they go to Thailand, they even go to Japan. In fact, in Japan, it's very cheap. And they devalue their currency right after the COVID, right? It's about 40%. So it's now so cheap to go to Japan. Our export competitiveness is eroding. I talked to my classmate Paul Kueking, he's Sumifru. Sabi niya, he's losing his market share to the Vietnamese. Sabi niya, his labor cost keeps increasing. But the exchange rate is not compensating for the increase in wages. So we're losing. Banana and pineapples are only globally competitive exports. Sige. So why the bias for a strong peso? All our devaluations have been caused by foreign exchange and strong economic crisis. Devaluations associated with crisis and suffering. Defensive devaluations. Unlike Vietnam and China, they had offensive devaluations. They devalued in order to promote their exports. Tayo, when our back is only against the wall, do we devalue? So there is this negative association with devaluation. So export competitiveness eroding. Ano pa yan? Before. Ayan, 4. Sige. So I think the Philippines is vulnerable to a global shock. 55% of our exports are import-dependent electronics subject to Trump. Well, I understand we have some exceptions to do the Trump tariffs, but still all our exports, well, agriculture was exempted, are subject to 90% tariffs by Trump. Labor exports threatened by low educational achievements. Then, of course, the high cost of doing business. That is why, despite our liberalization, retail trade liberalization, etc., FDI remains low compared with other countries. because the dollar cost of doing business in the Philippines remains high. In conclusion, the Philippine economy is fragile and vulnerable to a shock. Sige. Well, anyway, sa Thailand, when the Thai baht strengthens, they are in a panic. Dito, opposite tayo eh. We celebrate when the peso becomes strong. In fact, pag nakikita mo narinig mo kumisa sa radyo, mag-60 na, masama na to pagka ano, di ba? Oh, sige. So, Indian rupee has plunged. A weak rupee makes Indian BPO services relatively cheaper, increasing cost competition for Filipino providers. Of course, we still have advantages in terms of the accent, etc., but still, our BPO growth has been slowing down. No? Next. So, the Philippines remains inward-looking. Our trade to GDP is still quite low compared with our neighbors. Sige. Vietnam is 165% trade to GDP. Singapore is 322. Tayo, 66%. Trade means exports plus imports as a percentage of GDP. That's a measure of your outward-lookingness. So, an example why our elite remains inward-looking is, of course, our airport. Di ba? Sa ibang bansa, an airport is their face to the world, to investors, to tourists, etc. So that's why you see very nice airports in Thailand, Japan, China, etc. Dito, naging lang ng rent-seeking, di ba? Naiya Trip was considered one of the world's worst airports until its privatization. Although now it improved, but still not world-class, not comparable to our neighbors. No? So the Naiya Trip became a source of corruption. So we have to repudiate the past to grasp the future. The path forward is an antithesis of the past. We need to pivot away from the ideology of the 1987 Constitution of economic nationalism and statism. So why is it hard to induce market-oriented reforms in the Philippines? Because there's a unity of the left and the oligarchy in the Philippines. The strange bedfellow alliance of the left and the oligarchy to fight against more competition, opening up the economy, making the economy more outward-looking, and promoting dynamic capitalism. Doon sa hearing lang sa Congress, yung to change the Constitution. Yung mga nag-oppose doon, mga kaliwa at mga dilaw, at silently, the oligarchs, because they don't want competition. The Konektadong Pinoy Bill was heavily lobbied against by the oligarchs. No? So, dito sa Pilipinas, it's unique. In other countries, like the US, they're anti-monopolists. The left, the progressive, the anti-monopolists. Dito sa Pilipinas, they are protecting the oligarchy. And they're anti-exports, they're anti-trade, they're anti-foreign, they're anti-devaluation. But anyway, I will not discuss this anymore. It's the oligarch, they have an identity of interests. So, there are two modes of capitalism, rent-seeking and dynamic capitalism. What we want is the dynamic capitalism and the rent-seeking capitalism. Sige. So what's the solution? Open up the economy to more competition. Remove all barriers to entry, including all protectionist and Filipino-only and Filipino-first provisions. Change the Constitution to a constitutional convention, strengthening the political party system. So there are many, in fact, restrictions in our constitutions preventing us from harnessing our potential. For example, carbon farming. In carbon farming, you plant trees to capture carbon, di ba? But that requires 30 to 100 years. You're not supposed to cut the tree. Pero the Constitution only allows 25-25. So if you are a carbon, you have uncertainty. If after 25 years they will not renew the contract. So that's why foreigners are wary of entering into joint venture with the government over state lands because of the constitutional limitation. So it's one example. Another example is the prohibition of the practice of professions. It's very difficult to get experts here in the field because you have to go through the Philippine Regulation Commission. I mean, so many hoops that you have to jump before you can bring in foreign experts. So how can we be globally competitive if we are shutting ourselves off to foreign expertise? How, for example, how did the Chinese EV industry become the leading edge? They opened themselves up to foreign influence. They allowed Tesla to come in 100%. They made an exception, 100% on Tesla. Because what they did, they studied Tesla. They learned. And now, as you know, they're exporting BYD, Geely. At the same time, they imported experts. Yung mga designers nila, they come from Alfa Romeo, Rolls-Royce, etc. Hongji, for example. Nagpon sila from, marami silang foreign experts. Here, it's going to be difficult to do that because of the constitutional restrictions. So in agriculture, we need to increase the land retention limits and dismantle protectionism. Let depreciated currency protect local agriculture and promote agricultural exports. A depreciated currency is good for agriculture. It protects against the imports. At the same time, it encourages exports. There's so much potential for us to export our agricultural goods. In fact, I believe we should do agro-industrialization, the balanced growth of agriculture and industry. In fact, agriculture could be the basis for a lot of industrial products. Di ba, ang coconut, napakaraming chemicals that you can get out of coconut. Castor bean leads to brake fluids, etc. Marami. That's what we should promote is agri-industrialization. I disagree with those who prefer an industrial policy just based on hard industry. No. I think that's one of the reasons also these 5 industrial projects ni Ong Pin failed. It's not based on development of strong agriculture. The first reform that Deng did in China was in agriculture. That he allowed the farmers to retain their products and their profits, di ba? That resulted in a jump in agriculture productivity in China, which financed their industrialization drive. So we need to amend the labor code. And I think education as the equalizing reform. Dapat, instead of asset distribution, we should only create class conflict. Let's emphasize education as the equalizing reform. For the poor to have mobility, let's emphasize good education. So we need to make the country more outward-looking, and one of the ways to do this is to have an exchange rate, a depreciated currency, free trade agreements with the U.S. and other economies, and join the CPAf. We have the least FTAs in Asia. All the other countries like Vietnam is even member of CPTPP, Comprehensive Trade Agreement. Tayo, wala pa tayo dyan. That is why ang banana ata natin, tariffs in Japan is still 8%, di ba? 8 to 8%. Pero Vietnam, I think, slower because they're members of CPTP. Zero. O yun. See? It's another reason. We have a protectionist, nationalist mentality. No? Ayaw natin, we did not want to join before CPTP because we would have to allow foreigners to come into public utilities, for example. So we need to amend the central bank add to other development mandate. That's my suggestion. So just a summary, history and geopolitics have shaped Philippine economy. In the Philippine economy today, corruption is not new. Corruption happens because our political economic system exhibits an abnormal form of capitalism. Super profits to politics and monopolies, non-market extraction of surplus, dysfunctional corruption. The left and the oligarchy have entered an unlikely alliance. They have a strange bedfellow coalition. The Philippines remains inward-looking. The oligarchy is in regulated non-tradable sources, facing little or no global competition. Telecoms, banking, ports, real estate. In other countries, you have a Samsung and a LG or a TCMC, a Toyota. Dito, none of our oligarchy is to exports. They're all in regulated non-tradable industries. So the Philippine economy retains a bias for a strong peso and hard money. Ano pa? So an outward-looking economy is the antidote to corruption. Export-oriented economies have better governance and more efficient states. Singapore, Japan, Taiwan. Lahat ng mga export-oriented economies have better governance. Because their elite has to face the discipline of the market. The roads have to be well maintained in South Korea, or else how will they be able to export their television sets, for example? Okay, next. So to progress, the Philippines must reject its past, become more open to trade and investments, focus on education rather than asset distribution as an equalizing reform, and be more outward looking. That's it. Thank you. Can I take a seat? Yeah. There's a person very near and dear to me who, whenever we have a conversation about a company, the first question he asks is, anyway, now, it reflects the fact that in our thinking and our mentality, we have absorbed the idea that all the companies are owned by somebody very important. And in fact, that's what happened in our country. So it reflects part of that we won't think as a result of waiting. Let me serve as traffic for anybody.
Mike. Thank you very much po for your talk. Just going back to yung path dependence framework po, no? Thinking about our elites, parang what is your sense about why our elites are like this? I mean, we can imagine other countries also have elites pursuing their some level of self-interest, but still their countries develop. Pero here in the Philippines, yung pinursu na economic nationalism, statism na advocated by elites is more talagang extractive. Kumbaga, if we look at them as a class, parang bakit wala silang malasakit sa Pilipinas? So I'm just curious na what's your sense about this and how far back in history should we go back to understand their character? And as someone also who has access to the elites in some way, do you think they feel this way about themselves, or do they feel good about their performance in their contribution to Philippine development? Thank you po.
Well, part of the reason is really the exchange rate, di ba? The foreign exchange controls imposed because of the Belt Trade Act led to the extractive institution. So the name of the game in terms of economics was just political access. You know? So instead of developing products for the world market, they did not do so. So that's why our elite is like that. So partly the blame can be in the US in the sense that they impose all those conditions to us. No, unlike in South Korea or Japan, they were seen as a bulwark against communism. So there was a support that was given by the West. That's the broader strategic view. No, why the U.S. was relatively more promotive of development in South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, whereas they were more extractive dito sa Pilipinas. No, in Europe, that's why they had the Marshall Plan, because it was seen as a bulwark against Soviet communism, di ba? So may geopolitical aspect. Now, our elite is just because of the exchange rate and all of that. No, they're just into non-tradable services now. That's the reason why they're also responding to the price signals. And they cannot go into agriculture because of the 5-hectare limitation, di ba? Oh. So that's why our elite is like that. I hope I answered your question.
Baka iiyak na lang tayo lahat.
So, you're in agriculture, you have a great role to play to have really, if you're going to have inclusive development. It's really, agriculture has been, unfortunately, equated with the idea of small is beautiful. Di ba? So that's, but what we need is agribusiness. What we are advocating in the Foundation for Economic Freedom is to lift the retention limit to about at least 50 hectares. And then for publicly listed corporations, about 1,000 hectares. At least with 50 hectares, maybe a family-owned corporation, a family-owned business will be able to make it productive enough. No. Of course, they can lease, but it's only big corporations who prefer to lease. Kasi family-owned farms, family farms, they want to be able to pass it on to their children and grandchildren, right? So we should allow them some ownership beyond 5 hectares. But again, isang problema nga nakikita ko is the fact that the person tilling the soil is not the one on the title. Even if you're a big corporation, you want to lease. With the debt condonation law, you can now lease. But from whom will you lease it? Even if you can find one of the owners, how do you find the other? Yung mga kapatid niya. Baka nasa Saudi na. Alam mo, just even getting a notarization from an embassy in a foreign country, ang hirap-hirap na eh. So, paano kung yung kapatid niya na sa Saudi Arabia? Paano malilis yun? Oh. So, it's kind of messy.
Any other questions or comments? Mr. Adriano.
Yeah, you emphasize yung peso devaluation or the management of our monetary policy. That's one aspect of it. But don't you think that it's also because of the kind of governance and leaders that we have that didn't push really for an outward looking economy? Kasi if you compare, for example, during the time of Marcos and Park Chung-hee, South Korea's economy during that time was in, pits, practically the pits, talagang, But because of the leadership of Park Chung-hee, he forced the
export
conglomerates there to become outward-looking, export-oriented.
Oh.
But in contrast, Marcos did not do that, Kasi and that's the reason why if you look at even Japan, South Korea has Chaebol, Japan has Saibatsu. These are actually conglomerates, monopolists. But the government there had a vision to force them to become export-oriented, outward-looking. You compete, etc., etc. Isn't that a factor in leadership na yan that's so critical, not just in terms of evaluation? Because yung devaluation or something like that will depend on your overall economic strategy. If your overall economic strategy is outward-looking, it follows that you have to devalue, di ba?
Hindi ang problema yung vested interests are opposed to we have a weak state. A lot of vested interests, especially the Americans when they were allowed under the Laurel Agreement, were benefited from the protectionism. No? So if you're protected, etc., why would you go out? Why would you want to export? Right? So, yun ang sa akin, it's the opposite. Good governance will only follow if one is outward looking. In the case of South Korea, they had to develop because the North Koreans were breathing down their neck, hindi ba? I mean, if you look at the sample, all of the export-oriented so-called miracle economies, Malaysia, Singapore, their elites were threatened by the communists after World War II. So their elites had to be responsible. Dito, we had Americans to always, we see it as a cavalry who will rescue us from so our elite became irresponsible. We have an irresponsible elite. The other problem that we have now, and I think we have to fix it with the Constitution, is we don't have, there's a problem of collective action. In other countries, you have a single political party, Communist Party of Vietnam, PAP, UMNO in Malaysia, Kuomintang in Taiwan, so LDP in Japan, Communist Party in Vietnam. Dito, we don't have single political party. We don't have political parties. We have family dynasties. So that's the problem. There's a problem of collective action of developmental vision. Kasi it has to be beyond 4 years. It has to be 10, 20, 30 years of vision. Usually, there's a single political party that drives that vision. Communist Party in Vietnam or in China or the Kuomintang in Taiwan. But dito wala. It's political dynasties. No? But again, that's the default because we don't have really a political party system. The default has been family dynasties. Kasi if you're a businessman, punta ka mag-invest ka sa Makati, alam mo at least the B-nice will still be there. Hindi ba? Whereas if kung papalit-palit and then walang political party with, alam mo yung programa, there's uncertainty. Why will you invest? You don't know. Papalit-palit Just what we have now. Papalit-palit yung policies. We should correct that in the Constitution by having a political party system penalize party switching, at the same time have state funding for political parties. You cannot eliminate corruption if candidates have to raise 300 million, for example, to run for congressman. Yun ang narinig ko, minimum yun, 300 million. Eh, saan ka kukuha nun? You have to steal from the government, right? So, at least you can minimize that with some form of state funding for political parties.
The Constitution was supposed to have made the big change by allowing a certain number of representatives of special interest groups. That's the party-less system. But as we know, it's been subverted by the family dynasties anyway. So indeed, that points out that even constitutional provisions can be sabotaged by the path that we are on.
Kasi nga, rent-seeking yung capitalism natin Therefore, in fact, most of the congressmen implicated in the public works scandal come from party list, di ba? Akol party list, ACTT, basta mga party list
Okay, let's take a couple more questions, comments. One more.
You know, after listening to your presentation, it made me think about how clever this benevolent assimilation scheme that was done by the Americans to us. You know, all of these things actually, and we have this thinking that we're so close to the US, but in fact, in reality, it was really exploitative. It's one-sided kind of agreement. And yet we still love the Americans. You know, in fact, some of the people here thinks that AI means American intelligence. Di ba? But talagang we were really so exploited, the relationship. And if you think about it, unfortunately, we still have that what they call this, closeness to the Americans, despite the fact that they have done to us. And if you look at the distrust to China, it's so high. When in fact, the reality is that if you look at China, China never invaded any other country. So I think that's a key lesson that we need to instill to us in our minds as we forge a new kind of arrangement or the way we relate to China. And given this Trumpist economic nationalism, this isolationism that the Americans coming up, I think we need to rethink our policy towards China in the same manner that other countries which are pragmatic like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia do, so that we can develop our economy. Thank you.
I agree. I 100% agree. Uh, we have to rethink our foreign policy, especially now under Trump. Even he's against his own allies, right? I mean, like Denmark is an ally, and now he's going after them. So we cannot even rely that on the mutual defense treaty, that if we are attacked, the Americans will come to our aid. For one thing, they have an escape route there because it has to be approved by the U.S. Congress. No, so I agree 100%. Our biggest trade relationship is actually with China, no, not with the U.S. Unfortunately, our trade deficit with China is really increasing. Again, because we have a cheap peso, no. But we could have a productive relationship with China and elsewhere based on agriculture. Alam mo, kasi ang tingin ko, China now has about 30% of the world's manufacturing capacity. No? Mahirap to compete with them on certain manufactured goods. But agro-industrial goods, wala sila noon eh. Wala silang coconut oil eh, for example. So if we develop products from coconut oil, or even for example like pili, I understand pili pwede for medicinal purposes, for perfume, etc. So hindi makakompete ang China doon because wala naman silang pili. It's only in the Bicol area, right, that there's pili. It could be the macadamia nuts of like Hawaii, di ba? Meron siya, sa airport, makikita mo chocolate macadamia nuts. Bakit dito hindi yung pili? Oh. We could have a competitive advantage in agri-industries. Netherlands is based on agriculture. Their economy is based on advanced agriculture. So is New Zealand, di ba? So why can't we become a high-income country based on agro-industry? I'm not for heavy industries alone, but agro-industries. Now, in fact, a lot of medium-scale agro-industries. Ang dami, even for our marine resources. Did you know that the Philippines is one of the most diverse flora and fauna in the world? In terms of even yung mga DNA, di ba ang Pilipinas ang nag-develop noong sino ba yun? Si Baldomero Rivera, yung painkiller from the mollusk. He developed a painkiller from the mollusk the conus seashells. You look it up in Google. No? He developed the painkiller from that. No? So marami tayong agri-resources eh. We have the 5th longest shoreline in the world, and yet we import 90% of our salt. Salt is a basis for industry. You make sodium chloride, chlorine, etc. Tayo, we import our salt. Bakit? The DNR does not give kasi
shore leases.
Yeah. They have not. We are anti-development eh. Ang thinking ng gobyerno natin is regulatory, hindi developmental. We have a huge potential in forestry. We can produce 100 cubic meters of timber per hectare. Finland only produces 5 to 15 because they have a winter. Tayo, we are in a tropical climate. If we can develop a forestry industry. But again, because of the Constitution, because of a number of other restrictions, regulatory mindset ng DNR natin eh. No? Pati DA. Yeah. Almost our kind are very regulatory oriented. They're not development oriented. Well, yung salt now, at least it's with the DA now, but I don't know if they're doing something about it. Yeah.
Okay, now, any others before we close this morning? Very heavy, but yes, Mr. Thor. Yeah. Last one.
Thank you. Sir, just going back dun sa looking at the history to get a glimpse of the future, were there some instances from the past that we can draw on to that as strategies for challenging this vested interest, creating that space for kahit papaano rearranging the power balance? Thank you po.
That's why my recommendation is to change the constitution. Because we see it's our 1987 constitution that's caused our problems today. People don't seem to perceive that. When they say, oh, anong problema sa public works mess? We have to elect moral leaders. Bakit? Si Brother Eddie Villanueva ba? Hindi ba? Si Joel Villanueva, di ba kanyan? Pastor yan? Oh. Si Kibuloy, hindi ba religious rin yan? Oh. Miski na sabihin mong pare, hindi ba nagkaroon ng paring governor sa Pampanga? May nagawa ba siya? Hindi. It's the system. We have to start changing the economic model that is enshrined in our constitution. That's what the history is telling us. And I think we need to have a constitutional convention because walang faith in our congressmen for a constituent assembly. Let's have a constitutional convention to change the constitution. Barring that, I'm not so optimistic. We might go through another crisis again. We're already, yeah. But that's going to be worse. We are only seeing the, start.
Okay. Prepare for the next crisis. Shall we say thank you to Dr. Chikiamco? We should also say thank you to the Foundation for Economic Freedom that has partnered with us to get this done. And this will be recorded and it will be on the Facebook page of both FEF and UPLB. So we'll also share that. And may we request for a copy of the presentation? Yes? Okay. All right. So thank you very much. And here's a small token from the College of Public Affairs. Can we invite everybody to join us up here, the entire audience?